Hey, this is TJ from tjontheroad.com. Thanks for joining me. This is episode 9 of my deep dive series into the Waldorf Iridium. This is the last episode, and it's going to be a pros and cons episode as I do see it. Just want to say before we start, thank you for all the folks who have watched this series. Thank you for your questions and comments. They're all very welcome. Thank you. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy the support that you've given me. I have made a full list of pros and cons in a way that only a true gearhead can do. So we're going to dive into that. If you like the series that I'm doing here, please do share it and subscribe to this channel. There's going to be a lot more videos of other stuff that I do. And also check out tjontheroad.com for more. So hey, let's get started. So one thing to keep in mind, as of the posting of this video, this pros and cons is based on the firmware of 2.51, which is just one more update from the original firmware of 2.50. So things may come to pass, particularly my feature requests, wish lists, the con items that I'm going to mention. So hopefully that they do. Let's take a look at the pros first. And the first thing I want to mention is, well, it sounds really great. I mean, this thing sounds awesome. Nobody's going to mistake it for your poly analog synthesizer. It is fully digital, but unlike some other digital synthesizers that have sort of a signature of harshness or aliasing or brittleness to them, this doesn't have that kind of quality at all to it. If I could put words to it, I would say it is very clean sounding. It's like listening to a modern sounding recording. It has a very liquid, sometimes airy quality to it. It really has almost a high fidelity nature to it. It sounds really great. It's the kind of sound that I think will work really great in a full mix of synthesizers and blend really well. My next pro is the fact that, well, this isn't just one synthesizer, it's literally 5 synthesizers. And you can probably add a couple more in there because some of the other things that it can do. I mean, realistically, with the wavetable, the waveform, the particle engine, the resonator, the kernel engine, you get a lot more in this one synthesizer than you would ever see probably in any other one synthesizer that I've ever seen or ever come across. Now, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to argue that you can do all this stuff in software, and that may or may not be true, but I don't see any software that can do all of it all in one machine and blend it all together so well integrated, and so seamlessly with the user interface. That leads me to my next pro, which is the user interface itself. It is very quick and fast to use the pads, to use the dials. You can get around such a complex synthesizer, such a deep synth. There are literally thousands of different parameters in this synthesizer, but it's very easy to get around, very quick to move around it. I'm very happy to have this for that reason. The build quality. The build quality is really very good. Now, there have been some comments about some things, the wonkiness sometimes of these buttons and stuff like that. Honestly, it's no big deal. Get over it. Seriously, this stuff really works very well. They float inside the panels here, and they work just fine. Only on my worst OCD days do I ever even notice that anymore. Other things is, the knobs are on very solidly. This thing's a solid piece of hardware, so it really should be given the credit that it is due. Another great positive is, well, the fact this thing is floating in space right here. That's because it is on a VESA mount. That should be something I think that every tabletop-oriented synth should have from now on. This is the first one I've ever had that had such a thing. It is great. You can mount it right to the stand. You can mount it to just about anything. Awesome stuff. And then you can move it away. Now let's talk about the touch display. I also think that's a very strong pro for the Iridium. Takes a little while to get used to. I highly recommend to use your pinky because some of the touch points are small. You know, it's not as big as your iPad Pro. It's never going to be, but it's great that way in terms of being able to get around. Next pro I want to talk about is right here. That little screen right there is totally awesome. It gives you the voices and main output menu. It gives you a VU meter for the inputs. It gives you a scope analyzer, a Midi monitor, which I really, really like, and it gives you information on the CV inputs. This is something I think also a lot of synthesizers are missing. If you have a problem, something's not working, you need to troubleshoot, this is a huge help to find out what's going on and how to fix it. Next big pro for the Iridium is the autoplay functions, that being the arpeggiator, the sequencer, and the pad triggers. Really, really well laid out, easy to use. You can draw all kinds of things on here with your finger. You can get around pretty well. Very easy to use with the sequencer in terms of the rests and ties. I see some sequencers where you got to push like 3 different buttons sometimes to try to get that to work with very little user feedback as to what's really going on. So this does that really, really, really well. I think there are some elements that could be improved on, but I got to give it a big thumbs up for the most part out of the gate. Next big pro is the screen animations. For example, the filter animations. That is really, really great. It's fun to look at, first of all. And second of all, it's very, very useful to be able to see the filter along with the scope behind it to see where the frequencies are actually peaking throughout the harmonic series. Very, very useful. In fact, my only wish list here is that they had more of them. Say, for example, on the wavetables, I wish it would show the position as it moves when it travels through the wavetables. There are other places that I wish there were more of them. Hopefully they'd implement that type of stuff in the future. The next big pro for the Iridium is the fact that it is bitimbral. You're essentially getting 2 synthesizers in one here. Now think about that. You've got 5 synthesizer engines, right? You got 3 oscillators each. You've got arpeggiators, sequencers, all that can be running completely independently on 2 different splits, 2 different mini channels, all on their own. The only thing that's missing on that is the fact there's only 1 output. So, but, you know, how cool is that? I would say it's awesome. Now, when you look at this and you say, okay, I can get 2 different things going on at once with all that power, really, really great. And you can layer them so you can have a big fat sound, plus use the unison modes. You can get really nuts with that. Next great pro for the Iridium is all the support that it gives for things like polyphonic aftertouch. And the other great thing I really like is the MIDI learn support. You can touch one of these side control functions. Gives you the pop-up here, and you can do a MIDI learn. That's really great. So on your controller, all you need to do is dial a control, and it'll come up with that CC number right there. It'll learn it for that given destination. Really, really great, fast. Software does this all the time. Why doesn't more hardware? I don't know. Iridium's got it. Other great things are obviously the CV inputs. Now, as I said before, I'm not a big modular guy. The thing I like about the Iridium the most, it's basically modular in a box. I don't have to mess with a bunch of spaghetti cables. I like that. But if you're into that, all cool. Iridium's got 4 inputs, and you can set them to any destination within the Iridium. Another great function that really helps the Iridium to sound even better, I think, is its bass boost function. With the bass boost, I think it makes it sound tremendously better. All the videos and samples that I've done so far on the Iridium has had the bass boost on. In fact, I highly recommend the minute you get the Iridium, first thing you want to do, turn on the bass boost. All right, last pro I want to mention, and this is really, really important, I think. The presets that come with the Iridium are really awesome. There's some really cool stuff going on here. A lot of material that you can work from, learn from. I really, really was impressed by going through the presets. It's the first thing I always do when I get a synthesizer or any kind of a digital device or anything like that. I go through the presets largely because I want to hear what the designers intended and what other people are doing. There are some great designers on here. A lot of great people put a lot of effort into coming up with some great stuff. I highly recommend, again, after you turn on the bass boost, to go through all the presets. It's well worth the time. All right, that's enough of praise for the Iridium. Let's dig up some dirt. All right, we're going to talk about the cons. Now, keep in mind, a lot of these cons are just wish list items, frankly. They can be implemented at some point in the future. I sure hope they do. But this is what I think can be made improved upon, and or the design as is, and probably won't change, maybe could have been better. No synth is perfect. This synth is as close to being perfect as I've ever wanted, so just take that with a grain of salt. Let's get started with the cons. So the top of the list of my cons are going to be hardware related that probably won't be changed. And the biggest one is the pads. These pads have like zero feel to them. They're more like buttons than pads, frankly. I think if you've seen any of my comments elsewhere on social media about the pads, well, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but they have no feel, they have no velocity sensitivity, they have no pressure aftertouch type sensitivity. There's only 16 of them. Frankly, I think this space could have been better served by 32 smaller pads that were tightly fit together. It would make them a lot more usable. My next hardware item is something that I hope they can implement in the future, but as of now, the memory is somewhat limited. It's taken up by a lot of factory samples, which are good. They are very good. Great addition is the ability to use an SD card or a USB stick, and that could be up to a full terabyte of data. The problem with that is you can't stream off of it. So you got to move the data into there, into the internal memory in order for it to use it. And then you got to take it off of there if you want to use other data. So hopefully they can implement some streaming from those cards and or the sticks. Now the next hardware thing I think could have been improved on, or frankly, I think it could be a different design, is the way that this envelope section is laid out. It's a little bit confusing. Let me explain. It has two rows of ADSR envelopes, controls, and then you have the velocity control, but only on the top row do you have an amount control, because on the second row you have the master volume control. Also, you have the select button that selects the pairs, the three pairs for the top row and the bottom row. That's kind of confusing to use, frankly, for a number of different reasons. One, because there's only one amount on the top row. When you're trying to use it as a modulation destination, it only lets you do it for the top row. You can't do it for the bottom row. So if you try to do it for the bottom row, you have to go to the modulation matrix and fix it. Also, the way it's laid out. On the top row, the assignments are for filter 1, filter 2, and free filter number 2. Whereas the bottom row, it's the amp, the free filter 1, and the free filter 3. It makes no sense to me. It should have been, in my humble opinion, the amp and the two filters on the top row, and then the free filters on the bottom row. Would have made a lot more sense to do it that way. You're probably going to want to fiddle with the amp and the two filters as a single row, and then the free filters on the bottom row for other destinations. Moreover, I think that they could have eliminated the second row entirely. Just use one row, one selection for all the envelopes, just like you have to do with the LFOs. And then, this leads me to my next con. There's no macro controls on the Iridium other than the XY pad that, is done on the screen here. It would have made a lot of sense and a lot of great coolness if those 5 nods that are being used for the second envelopes they could have been macro controls. Just my opinion. Now, my next con, or probably this is more of a feature wish list type item, there is great glide controls within the Iridium. You can use glide as a modulation destination, which I really like. I often like to assign that to velocity. But it is a master glide for all three oscillators. It would have been great to have the ability to have glide for individual oscillators. So hopefully that's something they can implement in the future. Another great feature request that currently I would say is a con for the Iridium, that it does not yet have the ability to use an oscillator as a source for modulation, say into a different oscillator. You can't do one oscillator to another. You can do ring mod, that's the only one you can do, but you can't do other things like amplitude modulation or frequency modulation. Use it as an LFO, say for example, into a separate oscillator. So you can't take samples from the particle engine and use that for a different oscillator, say in the wavetable engine. All right, next we're going to talk about some things in the sequencer that I do think can be improved upon. First, there is no random direction in the sequencer. You have forward, backward, ping pong, forward and back, which is kind of like ping pong, except it repeats the last note and the first note. And you have a one shot, but there's no randomness in it. That would be really great. I know, for example, in this synthesizer up here, my Sequential Pro 3, it has a random function, and that's a lot of fun. Next thing about the sequencer, I do wish they had, it is a pattern sequencer as opposed to being a modulation sequencer. And the basic difference between the two is that the pattern sequencer requires a trigger. It requires that a note be played all the way through in order for it to motion through the different parameter changes that you want. You can't just push play on the sequencer without any notes being played and have it modulate through different parameters like a step sequencer, say for example, and be able to play your keyboard on top of it. So hopefully they'll be able to implement something like that. That does also lead me to another thing about the sequencer that kind of gives me a little bit of a bug, and that is the latch functions. Say for example, you cannot latch from the keyboard. You can't be playing the keyboard and then hit latch and it'll latch that. You have to do it from the pads. And oftentimes with the sequencer, it won't start by itself. I hit start, it doesn't start unless I play a keyboard note or I play the pads. Now the next big wish list item I have is the curves on the envelopes. There are 3 curve selections, your RC, your exponential, and your linear, but there's no in between there. Particularly the RC and the exponential are pretty much at extreme. So I think that it would be a big help for them to have, somewhere in between that and the linear. All right, next wish list item that currently I think is a little bit of a con, minor tweak I think in this case, is in the LFO screens. If you turn the speed all the way down, you'll see it stretches out, particularly on the sample and hold. If you turn it all the way down, you can't really tell what it's doing. It's just one big line. Change the skew, well, it changes the front there, but you can't really tell what it's doing. And since Iridium has LFOs that can be as slow as 240 seconds, which is pretty awesome, it really needs a little bit better scaling on the LFOs at those slow speeds. All right, let's talk about the filters. I really do like the filters. They probably should have been in my Pro section of this video. They're very, very flexible. They sound really, really good. But there is one thing that's missing, in my opinion, and that is a state variable filter with a ability to morph the filter. So if Waldorf, if you're listening, please put that in there. Thank you. Next, a couple things in the effects that are in my wish list. So they're going to be on the con side of this video. The inability to have any parallel effects is really kind of a downer to me because you have 5 slots here. It would be really, really great, particularly if you can run parallel to the delay and reverb, so the delay is not feeding into the reverb. You can separate those two. Say with some kind of knob function or something like that, that would be really awesome. The other thing about the delay and reverb is there is only one type each. The delay sort of has a ping pong type of effect going on there, and the reverb has a Hall effect. There is no other types of effects. There's no reverse reverb. There's no, reverse delay. There's no, or reverse reverb for that matter. There's no cloud type of reverb. There's no spring or plate reverb. Other types of reverbs would be really, really fun, as well as different types of delays. All right, some additional feature ideas. With these individual controls, you see me oftentimes I hit this. Okay, oftentimes it's really hard to get the extra screen to come up. It really requires some point, and it's really difficult to tell where it is you have to touch it. Sometimes it'll change the parameters. Other times the screen will actually come up. So this is just the one area where the touchscreen I think needs some improvement. There really needs to be a defined point where you have to touch it in order for this menu to come up. There are spaces below here, each individual one. I think that would be very helpful to be designated as a touch point for this pop-up to come up. Now also, with this pop-up, you'll see here you have the ability to change the scaling of it from normal to fine to superfine, so you can really dial in superfine control elements. But there are a lot of great panel controls that in some particularly oscillator sections that are not available as side parameters per se in the screen. Those ones you can't have any fine control over. Say, for example, if I pull the travel up here, there's no travel here on each side. There's no way to fine-tune that. It's very, very challenging to get a specific value that you're looking for. Okay, my next wish list, feature request item and currently con for the current firmware is in the bitemporality of the synth. When you do a split mode and you want to use an external keyboard, well, you've got to use it with two different MIDI channels. You can't just have one MIDI channel, say, for the lower side of the keyboard and the same MIDI channel controlling the upper side of the keyboard. So you need a controller that can send two different MIDI channels at the same time in order to run both engines as two 8-voice engines, say, for example. My next wish list item is hopefully they get MPE support here. MPE support for this synth would be totally awesome. There are so many different new controllers that are coming out and are also out there already that have MPE with something this, frankly, uber expensive and uber synthesizer with all these modulation destinations that are available. Having MPE support would be really, really great. I know that's also on the feature request list, so hopefully it comes out soon. All right, so lastly, in my feature request wish list items, currently cons, is the sampling auto mapping. Well, there really isn't any auto mapping. You have to do everything by hand. After you sample, you've got to set the bass note of the sample, and then you have to set the range in there. If you looked at my sampling video, I had to speed up the video all the times, and I had to keep dialing up the different ranges of the sample where it would transpose, as well as the center sample where I wanted it on the keyboard. Some type of auto mapping function would make the sampling very much more usable within the Iridium. All right, my last con is bugs. Now, I have gotten, and I know other people have gotten, what I called the white screen of death. For no apparent reason, at least 2 times, just as I was going through it, not doing anything other than what I'm expected to be doing, it just would go completely white on the screen and the entire synth would freeze. Now, rebooting fixed it, but it is a little bit disconcerting, to say the least. Fortunately, I didn't lose any major data. I have a habit of saving like constantly when I'm making changes. So I didn't lose anything, but hopefully they can fix that in a firmware upgrade and it's not something hardware related. that's it. Episode 9. This is the last episode of my pros and cons on the Waldorf Iridium. Thank you for all of you who have watched this video series. Thank you so much for your support. If you have any questions or comments, you're more than welcome to go down there and make them. I do answer as many, or if not all of them, I can, that I do see. And if you have anything else that you'd like to see, let me know. I may be able to put that out in a future video. Check out tjontheroad.com for more. Subscribe to this channel. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.